What if the house you live in remembers someone else's life and erases your own? The Memory Palace. Sydney, late evening. A narrow street in the old harbor district gleamed after rain, lamplights spilling in golden patches across wet cobblestones. On the corner stood a house, brand new, yet already woven into the fabric of the place. Glass panels, warm wood, clean lines. Grace Wellington's design, her pride, her latest career peak. She stood across the street, tablet with the final plan in her hands, fingers unconsciously stroking an old brass key on a faded ribbon hidden in her coat pocket. The key belonged to a house that no longer existed. Today she was handing over the property to its new owners. A young couple, Tom and Leanne, glowed with anticipation. Inside, the air smelled of fresh timber and paint. Grace led them through the rooms, pointing out hidden lighting systems, fluid transitions between spaces, windows opening to the waterfront light. On one wall, a shaft of sunlight filtering through the glass roof module formed a spiral pattern, random, yet strangely harmonious. "Do you live in a similar house yourself?" Leanne asked. "No," Grace replied briefly, and, to change the subject, she opened the bedroom door. She never spoke of her mother to clients. Tom suddenly stopped in the hallway. "Did you hear that?" he whispered to Leanne. In the house's stillness came the sound of a child's laughter, muffled as if from deep inside the walls. Leanne waved it off, probably the neighbors. When they reached the second floor, Grace noticed in the stairwell glass a reflection. A woman, head slightly tilted, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture her mother often made when deep in thought. The stairs were empty. After the couple left, Grace remained alone. She ran her palm along the smooth living room panel, and an image flashed in her mind. A nursery, an old plush teddy bear on the windowsill, the scent of lavender. A memory, but not hers. Locking the door and engaging the automatic system, she walked away without looking back, though she felt someone watching from the upstairs window. The house was not yet inhabited, but it already held someone's story, and it was ready to tell it. Grace's days began the same way. Early coffee in a thin porcelain cup placed at the right edge of the kitchen table. Morning pages, 3 sheets in longhand, even when she had nothing to say. Quiet, wordless music while she checked her email. These rituals kept order in her head. 2 weeks after handing over the Argyle Street house, the ritual broke. Leanne, the new owner, called early one morning. Her voice was tense, almost a whisper. She spoke of dreaming about another life, celebrating someone's birthday in an old kitchen under a brass-shaded lamp, remembering the smell of cinnamon and the name of a dog she had never met. A few days later, a woman from another house Grace had built the year before reported sticky memories. She knew the sound of a pantry door in a house across the city, though she had never been there. Grace spread her old projects across the table. Only then did she notice repeating motifs, spirals in corridors, intersections, symmetries, not for beauty's sake, but as if preserving some hidden schema. She recalled her architecture professor's words, "Some spaces are keepers. They absorb what has been lived within them." To investigate, she called David Chen, an old friend and neuroscientist. He had a personal reason for interest. Years earlier, his younger brother had lost his memory after an accident, and since then, David had studied the mechanisms of memory retention. They met in a small cafe by the waterfront. Grace laid out the floor plans. David overlaid them and stared for a long moment. "This looks like a map of the hippocampus," he said finally. the part of the brain where memories form. Only intense, saturated episodes get recorded. Anchors are things like objects, smells, light. They ran a test. They fed all her projects from the past decade into a program. On the screen emerged a recurring fragment, a complex spiral dated to a time before Grace had even started her private practice. She couldn't remember when or why she had drawn it. In that moment, she understood. The story had begun earlier than she thought. At dawn, Grace drove toward the ocean coast, to the site of her first completed project, a house on a cliff. 10 years ago, she had designed it for a man she loved. She thought it would be their home, the start of a new life. Fate had other plans. He left, and 6 months later died in an accident. The project was finished for other clients, but Grace had never returned. Now the path to the house was overgrown, stones slick with morning dew. Salt wind carried gull cries and the steady rhythm of the surf. When Henry, the current owner, opened the door, he studied her for a long moment before saying, "You came back, sweetheart." Inside, everything had changed, yet the space felt dense, saturated. Sunlight refracting through the panoramic windows moved slowly along the walls, forming recurring patterns. Through them, Grace heard a faint hum, as if the house breathed with the ocean's rhythm. She remembered unconsciously incorporating lines from her mother's childhood sketchbook, spirals and rhythms once woven into her lullabies, into the floor plan. Henry led her to the living room. In the window chair, he said, "My wife used to knit in the evenings." He looked at Grace as if seeing her past self. "You have her eyes," he murmured. Upstairs, in a bedroom, light and shadow gave the sense of a presence. Opening a hidden door beneath the stairs, Henry revealed a small subfloor compartment. In the dust lay a fragment of an old wooden frame, engraved with a pattern identical to her earliest sketches. She touched the carving and was struck by a wave of someone else's memory. Evening, jasmine tea, quiet laughter. She realized this house held not only its residents' stories, but also her own loss, built into the walls from the start. And perhaps it was here that the code, now present in all her projects, was born. That evening, Grace spread all her archived blueprints and photographs across her studio floor. On her laptop, she opened a list of addresses and phone numbers, a decade of clients. She began making calls. A woman from the suburbs described a scene: rainy evening, old kitchen with green curtains, the sound of water dripping into a sink. A man on the outskirts said he dreamed of walking through a mountain house he had never seen. A young couple from a recent project reported that their child suddenly began naming strangers and singing a lullaby they had never taught him. A pattern emerged. Memories traveled between houses. They transferred only when strong enough, saturated with emotion, born in moments of joy or pain. These episodes recorded themselves through anchors, objects, smells, lighting. The geometry of the houses, built to the same code, worked as a resonant network, carrying them further. David, listening in, concluded, those most susceptible were people in grief, under stress, or emotionally open. Such residents more easily received others' memories and gave up their own in return. "But there's another side," he said, removing his glasses. "Some find comfort in these images. The bereaved receive fragments of someone else's happy moments. If we shut down the network, we take that away." The thought lodged in Grace's mind like a splinter. Which mattered more, protecting oneself from loss or preserving the right to illusory comfort. Late that night, she mapped the city, marking all her houses. The points connected into a complex structure. At the center shone a nodal house, an old mansion on the outskirts, sending out the thickest lines. And one more detail made her freeze. Almost as powerful a node was her own home. It wasn't just part of the network, it was one of its main vessels. At first, Grace ignored the small lapses. A forgotten email password, the name of a designer she'd worked with only a week earlier. But the gaps deepened. Once, she stopped in the street, unable to remember where she was going, though her car keys were in her hand. Days later, while discussing the latest data with David, he fell silent. "I just remembered walking through a vineyard in Provence," he said, frowning, "but I've never been there." He realized the network had reached him, too, perhaps through the calls and emotional resonance with the residents. Now, both of them had a personal stake. Grace knew, if they waited, they would lose themselves completely. She decided to go to the nodal house. But first, she prepared, creating counter-anchors to hold her real memories. She soaked a handkerchief in her favorite coffee roast, tucked a piece of fabric from her workshop chair into her pocket, and marked a small photo with the words, "This is Mom." That evening, she met David to discuss details. He proposed an alternative, partial shutdown, isolating certain houses. But Grace had already decided, break the network entirely, even if some memories would be lost forever. Late at night, walking through her own hallway, she saw an odd glow. In the wall mirror appeared a plan, lines and patterns she knew by heart. It was the blueprint of the nodal mansion. The lines pulsed softly, as if the house itself were projecting them, pleading with her not to come. She lingered, but didn't retreat. If the house was a vessel, it might be trying to protect itself. But she knew, protecting houses cost their residents too much. In 24 hours, she and David would stand at the mansion gates, and there it would be decided whose memories remained and whose vanished. The mansion on the outskirts met them with cold and taut silence. The gates groaned as if resisting. Grace, eyes fixed on the facade, gripped the brass key on the faded ribbon in her pocket. The metal was warm, as if it had absorbed her mother's touch. Anchors. In the yard, they began with objects. Toys smelling of lavender, boxes of letters, embroidered handkerchiefs, old armchairs, anything that could hold memory. They carried out and piled near a fire barrel. As flame consumed fabric and paper, the house responded. First a whisper, then a many-voiced chorus vibrating in their bones. The floor shuddered, window glass trembled, doors slammed shut, cutting off exits. David pressed the coffee-scented handkerchief to her face. She inhaled and returned to herself. Geometry. Inside, Grace worked like a surgeon. She installed prepared panels and braces, wedged them into doorways, broke arched passages into sharp angles. Each change disrupted the symmetry of the neural code. She tore into false ceilings, blocking light lines so that sun patterns no longer spiraled across the floors. The house fought back. Drafts rose in the rooms. Metal beams resonated, the sound vibrating in her chest. David kept the counter-anchors ready, the fabric scrap, the labeled photo. The price. In the attic, amid dust, stood a chair with faded upholstery. As Grace approached, the air grew dense, like before a storm. The moment her hand touched the armrest, a door opened inside her. Morning light sliding across curtains, her mother in a house dress holding a cup of tea, humming the melody Grace had known since childhood. She felt the scent of jasmine and old wood, the warmth of a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't just a memory. It was her one wholly happy moment, untouched by other lives. She knew to take it away would leave a gaping hole in her inner self. The house's hum swelled, as if it sensed her hesitation. Her hand shook. She closed her eyes, trying to hold every detail. The curve of her mother's smile, the soft laugh, the shift of her shoulder as if about to turn toward her. But the harder she tried, the clearer it became. To free the others, she would have to lose herself here forever. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not knowing if she spoke to her mother or herself. And let the image dissolve, layer by layer. The scent faded, the voice faded, the hands vanished, and finally the figure itself. Only silence remained, and a faint cold in her chest, like a wind that no longer belonged to her. The hum in the walls broke off, and the house seemed to exhale. Aftermath. A wave rolled through the city, an echo surge. People living in her houses saw strangers' lives for a heartbeat. Weddings, funerals, children's laughter, scenes of loss. Then all was gone, and silence became complete. When they left, the house was empty, depersonalized, forever inaccessible. On the threshold, Grace squeezed the key on the ribbon. Through an open living room window, a ray of light fell, breaking into a spiral. She knew it was a farewell gesture. 3 months later, autumn Sydney smelled of acacia and salt. Grace walked through a new district, tablet with a project in hand. Her phone was silent. No more calls about strange dreams. People lived only their own lives now. She had changed. Now she worked as an architect who built not only houses, but safeguards. Every project had an empty room, windows placed so light never formed closed patterns, materials chosen so they would not trap scents. She had created a small course for young architects, Ethics of Spatial Memory, without mentioning what she herself knew. Sometimes, old houses still produced faint echoes, a trace of déjà vu, or the smell of lavender on an empty stairwell. For that, David had set up a hotline. His article on memory architecture circulated quietly in the professional community. That evening, Grace returned to her workshop. On the shelf stood the brass key on its ribbon. She picked it up, and without trying to remember her mother's face, simply felt the metal's warmth in her palm. It was no longer a scar, but a tool, a reminder that any space can be made safe. The next morning, inspecting a new house, she stepped into the empty room. In the silence, there was a faint rustle in the wall. She felt no fear, only placed her hand on the surface and said quietly, "You'll stay free here."